Supreme Court ruling. The justices strike down a Louisiana pro-life law. We have a report and reaction. Coronavirus crisis. New developments in the fight against the pandemic and how the Trump administration is responding. Celebrating Sunday Mass. Good news for the faithful in New York City. And Pillars of Christianity. How Saints Peter and Paul are honored in the city of Rome. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 29th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. A divided Supreme Court strikes down a pro-life Louisiana law regulating abortion facilities. It required abortion facilities to maintain the same safety and health standards as all other state surgical centers and required abortionists to have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals. In a 5-4 decision, the High Court ruled the law placed an undue burden on women seeking abortions. Correspondent Mark Irons joins us now from outside of the Supreme Court with more. Mark?
Tracy, this is the first major abortion case since President Trump appointed Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh here to the Supreme Court. Now, both of them voted in favor of upholding this Louisiana law, but Chief Justice John Roberts voted alongside the court's 4 liberal justices. And today, the pro-life community is greatly disappointed in this ruling.
Really horrified, by this decision.
The president of the March for Life denounces today's ruling. Jeannie Mancini says in reality, the High Court's decision only hurts women's health.
Abortion is not a simple, safe, little easy surgery, and it's so much better for women's health if these doctors have admitting privileges.
The deciding vote came from Chief Justice John Roberts, a Catholic. The case, June Medical Services versus Rousseau, very similar to another case before the Supreme Court in 2016, when it struck down a pro-life law in Texas. Though Roberts disagreed at that time, today, he wrote, "The result in this case is controlled by our decision 4 years ago invalidating a nearly identical Texas law." The pro-life group Susan B. Anthony lists reacted to the Chief Justice's key vote.
Now he has turned his back on the pro-life movement by striking down this law with the liberal justices, and we are very disappointed.
Conservative Justice Clarence Thomas writing in his dissent, "Today, a majority of the court perpetuates its ill-founded abortion jurisprudence by enjoining a perfectly legitimate state law and doing so without jurisdiction." Thomas joined in dissent by Samuel Alito and President Trump appointees Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch. In a statement today, the White House adds, the Supreme Court devalued both the health of mothers and the lives of unborn children by gutting Louisiana's policy. Continuing, states have legitimate interest in regulating any medical procedure, including abortions, to protect patient safety.
Planned Parenthood and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi praised today's ruling. It will allow 3 abortion facilities to remain open in Louisiana. And I want to read you part of a statement from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops today in response. They say, in part, abortion becomes even more destructive when basic health and safety standards are ignored and profit margins are prioritized over women's lives. Tracy.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. Correspondent Mark Irons reporting for us tonight. And joining me now on Skype to talk more about today's decision is Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal advisor for the Catholic Association Foundation. Andrea, welcome back. So good to see you.
Thank you, Tracy, for having me. I wish I had better news.
I know. Well, I want to start out, Andrea, by getting your reaction to today's decision and what it means.
You know, reading through the multiple opinions in this case, it really shows you how confusing the abortion issue is, even for the courts. As you'd mentioned before, the 4 justices in the plurality, led by Justice Breyer, tied on to a case that was decided back in 2016. Chief Justice Roberts joined in on that, on the concept of stare decisis, basically that the precedent of the court needs to be respected. What I think we should see in all of this is a silver lining that 4 of the dissenting justices wrote vigorously against this travesty of ruling unconstitutional the Louisiana admitting privileges case. And so I think that there's a lot of hope moving forward.
Andrea, as you mentioned, also as Mark mentioned in his report, Chief Justice John Roberts, who once again sided with the court's more liberal justices, cited that precedent in the earlier case in Texas as the basis for his vote. But are the laws in question really the same here?
They are the same in that they do require abortionists performing in their abortions in the state to have admitting privileges within 30 miles of a hospital where the abortions are being performed. But what's very interesting and important to note is that Louisiana developed a very strong factual record to support this admitting privileges law. And Justice Gorsuch, in his dissenting opinion, points out all the very important considerations that the state lawmakers had in mind when they came up with this rule.
And as the court is certainly divided on this issue, that's pretty obvious. In fact, Justice Clarence Thomas criticized the decision, writing, "Our abortion precedents are grievously wrong and should be overruled." Can we talk a little bit more about this divisiveness? And does it seem like things are becoming a little more strained when it comes to abortion?
Well, I think that the court has always struggled on the issue of abortion, and this case is a perfect example of how there's so much misunderstanding about the truth related to life and related to the rule of law. What is very important to know is that the four dissenting justices, again, in very cogent argumentation, in very much tied to the rule of law, said that there is an important opportunity that needs to come again before the court to get its abortion jurisprudence back on the rails, consistent with all the other standards, especially regarding who can go to court and how we can make sure that abortionists and their centers don't muddy the waters anymore and frustrate lawmakers trying to protect women.
Well, Andrea, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'm curious, what, if any, influence do you think the rulings that we're seeing from the High Court will have in this election year?
I really think that they should have an important encouragement for people to get out and vote. All pro-life people know that until Roe versus Wade is overturned, there's a constitutional declaration that there's a right to an abortion. That's a questionable decision that was made several decades ago and needs to be revisited. And it looks like at least 4 of the justices are willing to entertain that if a case comes before them.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for your time today. We always appreciate you coming on and giving us your insight on these matters. Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal advisor for the Catholic Association Foundation. Thank you again, Andrea.
Thank you, Tracy.
The only abortion clinic in Missouri received its license last Thursday, and the health department had until today to appeal the decision. Last month, regulators ruled the Missouri Department of Health was wrong not to renew the license of Planned Parenthood in St. Louis. The license was revoked last year. And you could read more about why the Missouri abortion clinic's license was revoked by visiting our sister publication, CatholicNewsAgency.com. The White House pushes back against a report claiming that President Donald Trump knew about an alleged plot against U.S. troops. The report says Russia secretly offered bounties for militants to kill American troops in Afghanistan.
There was not a consensus among the intelligence community, and in fact, there were dissenting opinions within the intelligence community, and it would not be elevated to the president until it was verified. Law and order are
the White House press secretary says top intelligence officials all confirmed that President Trump and Vice President Pence were not previously briefed on the Russia report. Former Vice President Joe Biden still takes aim at the president.
Not only has he failed to sanction or impose any kind of consequences on Russia for this egregious violation of international law, Donald Trump has continued his embarrassing campaign of deference and debasing himself before Vladimir Putin.
The Democratic presidential candidate says President Trump has betrayed his duty to protect U.S. troops. President Trump calls the story another fabricated Russia hoax by the fake news. President Donald Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services issues a dire warning about the spread of coronavirus. Johns Hopkins University says the pandemic has claimed more than 500,000 lives worldwide, and more than a quarter of that total comes from the United States.
This is a very, very serious situation, and the window is closing for us to take action and get this under control.
Health Secretary Alex Azar says along with a jump in coronavirus cases, hospitalizations in southern states are also on the rise. But he denies that reopening businesses too quickly was tied to the rise in cases. Even so, the Trump campaign called off Vice President Mike Pence's campaign rallies this week in Florida and Arizona.
We encourage everyone to wear a mask in the affected areas and where you can't maintain social distancing.
The vice president still traveled to Texas yesterday, where he met with the state's governor and attended a freedom rally at a Baptist church. Only about half of the people attending the church rally wore masks, even though Texas is one of at least 31 states seeing a rise in coronavirus cases. In California, some businesses are shutting down again, just days after opening their doors.
At some point, we have to say this is where we are as a business and as a state, and we're going to adjust.
We want to get the economy back, but you've got to do it in a measured way. And now we're seeing the consequences of community spread.
Yet Secretary Azar maintains the U.S. is in a better position than ever before to track and treat the virus.
We now have 3 therapeutics. We have hospital capacity. We have reserves of personal protective equipment. We're speeding our way towards having vaccines.
U.S. lawmakers continue to battle over police reform. A new national law following the deaths of George Floyd and other black Americans seemed to be imminent, but Republicans and Democrats can't seem to move forward. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, we're really seeing common elements between the two bills, both the House bill and the Senate bill. But the two sides, they just couldn't come together over the process. And I tell you what, it really expressed a lack of trust between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. Senate Republicans say Democrats are not cooperating on police reform legislation because they want it to still be an issue come November, when Americans go to the polls.
We cannot get something done if the Democrats in the Senate are more interested in presidential politics than they are getting something actually finished this year.
Last Thursday, as the House passed the Democrats' police reform bill, Democratic leader Chuck Schumer criticized the GOP's effort at legislating change.
Unlike the Republican bill, the Justice in Policing Act will bring sorely needed accountability to police officers who are guilty of misconduct, including qualified immunity reform.
Democrats want to eliminate qualified immunity, which protects officers from lawsuits for action they take while on the job. Republicans want to preserve it.
Speaking to Senator Booker, we don't think the issue is going to go away until there's some resolution that addresses some reform of qualified immunity.
GOP Senator Mike Braun has a bill aimed at bringing the two parties together.
My bill, we put a lot of work into it, will prevent frivolous lawsuits, but still have a pathway to where you can find resolution on these kind of horrific cases that happen too repeatedly.
Senate Leader Mitch McConnell says it's the Democrats who are in the way of lasting police reform.
We're trying to finish it before the 4th of July, but it requires some level of cooperation.
South Carolina Senator Tim Scott said it's, quote, a crying shame that the Democrats are playing politics with police reform. He does plan to meet with House Democrats, including the Congressional Black Caucus, the chairwoman, Karen Bass, to work out their differences. Tracy?
Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you so much, Eric. St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City resumes public Sunday masses, and New Yorkers are thrilled.
The church was closed, but my heart never closed. I stay home and do inner cleansing and pray. And now that the church is going to open, I'm very excited because I can go get my Holy Communion.
Only about a quarter of the number of people who typically attend Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral were there yesterday. Those in attendance had to stay 6 feet apart and wear face masks. But it was the first public Sunday Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 3 months. A brazen attack this morning on Pakistan's stock exchange, and it was all caught on surveillance cameras. 4 heavily armed gunmen launched the attack. They threw grenades at the main gate and opened fire with automatic rifles. They killed 2 guards and a policeman. The guards shot back and killed all 4 attackers. According to police, they did not make it onto the trading floor. 7 others were injured during that attack. A court in France has found a former prime minister guilty of fraud for using public funds to give his wife a fake job. Former Prime Minister François Fillon arrived at a Paris court this morning. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the so-called fake job scandal. He's accused of using government money to pay his wife over $1 million since 1998 for a job she never had. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is launching an infrastructure spending blitz to revitalize the battered UK economy following the coronavirus pandemic.
It's not just important to improve our schools, but given where we are now in the economic cycle, given coming out of the medical COVID crisis into the economic aftershocks, we want to be investing in stuff that's going to drive jobs, drive high-skilled, high-paid jobs and apprenticeships.
Johnson says the government will spend an initial £1 billion as part of a 10-year project. Also in London, lawyers for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange tell a British judge that their client is too sick to appear by video link from prison. But the judge is warning him that he must appear at his next court hearing. He is fighting extradition to the U.S. for publishing classified documents. Pope Francis says showing gratitude is a sign of the kingdom of God.
Non c'è vero amore senza croce.
At his weekly talk to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says being thankful and showing concern for others is contagious and can change others. Pope Francis also says life as a disciple of Christ means that we put God ahead of ourselves. In doing so, we ensure his help when we carry our cross of daily struggles. Pope Francis also addressed pilgrims at the Vatican today, and he revealed the secret to a happy life. The Holy Father says the key to happiness is to recognize Jesus as the living God. Pope Francis also invited the faithful to make our lives a gift to the Lord. He says the Blessed Virgin will help us put her Son at the center of our daily routine. Coming up, lawmakers in Mississippi are debating the state flag. We'll explain. Disturbing reports tonight that the Chinese government is forcing birth control on the country's Uyghur Muslims in order to lower birth rates among the minority population. According to an Associated Press investigation based on government statistics, birth rates in heavily Uyghur regions have plunged over 60% in just 3 years. Joining me now on Skype to talk more about this is Nuri Turkal, Commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Nuri, welcome back to the show. So some experts are saying that this practice is leading to a form of what they are calling demographic genocide. What are your thoughts on this report, and what else can you tell us about this population control measures?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. No adjective is required as if this is some sort of a new metaphor. This is a straight out of the genocide. This meets the legal requirements for the text in the Genocide Convention that the Chinese government is reverting, preventing the Uyghur population growth with forced measures, such as forcing Uyghur women to insert IUDs, punishing Uyghur mothers who is actually following the guideline with the potential imprisonment or detention in the modern-day concentration camps. So, this should shock the conscience of the people in the civilized world. It's inconceivable that we're having this conversation in 2020, that a government that the international community has a business diplomatic relationship with, committing this kind of genocidal policies, engaging in this kind of genocidal practices in the 21st century. The business as usual must stop. I call on the countries, including the United States, to revisit their relationship with communist China. Some countries some countries silence on the issue. The Uyghur crisis that entered its third year is a tacit approval of communist China's crimes against humanity being committed on the Uyghur population.
Yeah, and Nori, I know that you've been a tireless advocate for the rights of the Uyghur people. Can you give us an idea of what the conditions are like for those so-called voluntary re-education camps?
It's no re-education camp at all. These are concentration camps. It's not because legal scholars, activists, or advocates like myself been saying this in the last 2-3 years. Let's look at the language that the Chinese government is using. Let's look at the policy objectives. They use the terms like "jizhong," meaning concentration, in the secret documents released through the New York Times last November, and also look at their official statements that specifically said that these camps are set up to break the roots, lineage, and connection of the Uyghur people. So, I need to have more time to get into the details of what's happening in the last 3 years. But simply put, the Chinese government built, managed, and expanded concentration camps, and they're using technology to surveil the Uyghur population. Just imagine East German Stasi with AI clotting system. And also the Chinese government is using its diplomatic and economic influence around the world to buy out silence from the countries. Last summer, there were the Chinese government created false division in the world, 22 Western countries plus Japan against some odd 50 countries, most of them Muslim majority countries, came out in defense of the Chinese government. That includes Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, and others. The civilized world, the people who appreciate human rights, religious freedom, should not let the Chinese government to test our conscience, test civilized world's conscience in the face of this evil.
Well, Nori, thank you so much for coming on and bringing to light this issue for people that may not even be aware of it. Nori Turkel, Commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you again, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you very much for having me.
The state of Mississippi is removing the Confederate battle emblem from its state flag. It is the last state with a Confederate symbol still on a flag. Lawmakers in Mississippi voted yesterday to design a new state flag without the emblem, but the new flag must have the words, "In God We Trust." Mississippi voters will approve the new flag in the November election. Up next, Pope Francis tells the faithful to be challenged by Christ. Plus, how the city of Rome honors its two patron saints. Today is the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, and Pope Francis says that we should do as they did and allow ourselves to be challenged by Christ.
Solo la preghiera spiana la via all'unità.
Celebrating Mass in the Vatican's Basilica this morning, the Holy Father says Saints Peter and Paul built unity in the Church and between themselves. They were very different personalities, but they allowed God to transform themselves and those around them. And finally tonight, Saints Peter and Paul are more than just pillars of Christianity. They are also the patron saints of Rome. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Alan Holdren tells us more.
Saints Peter and Paul are often shown together. Historically, pilgrims were welcomed to Rome by the two saints guarding the Sant'Angelo Bridge that leads to the Vatican. Art historian and Rome resident Elizabeth Lev tells us the story of the patron saints of Rome through the architecture of two papal basilicas, St. Paul's outside the walls and St. Peter's.
One of the most important points about these two basilicas is this twinship between Peter and Paul. They're always placed side by side, celebrated on the same day, because as the two apostles died here, they were born together in heaven. these new twin martyrs would be the ones that would refound the Christian city, and that is emphasized not only in the matching statues, but when the emperors rebuilt this church in the 5th century, they turned it. So no longer does it face like St. Peter's, like all the other churches. It doesn't face east, it faces west. It faces St. Peter's. So the two of them look at each other. The two brothers embrace across the city in the very urban planning of the two churches.
Typically, the celebration of the patron saints of Rome begins in the evening of June the 28th in the Vatican Basilica, when the statue of St. Peter is dressed as a pontiff. The feast is celebrated with Mass the next day in St. Peter's, and Vespers at St. Paul's outside the walls. The New Testament is our main source as to the life of these two great apostles. However, the Holy Scriptures don't say when or how either St. Peter or St. Paul died. To find out more about their martyrdom, we need to go inside the two churches bearing their names.
It started out as a place of sadness and mourning, and the body was placed into what we're assuming was a fairly simple, very simple hole in the ground, with a few years later perhaps some sort of memorial placed on top of it so that the first few pilgrims would be able to find the tomb of St. Paul. And then from there, with the moment of the legalization of Christianity, it blossomed into something greater and greater and greater.
Some skeptics don't believe that the remains of St. Paul are really present in the basilica, but on December the 6th, 2006, archaeologists confirmed the existence of a white marble sarcophagus beneath the altar and attributed it to St. Paul.
The amazing part of this story and everything you see flowering behind it is that this is the moment that the Romans finally made a mistake. It was the moment when it seemed that they had crushed out the Christians, they had rid themselves of this Christian presence, but actually inadvertently throwing that body in the hole in the ground, thinking they had taken out the trash, the Romans planted a seed. And we look at the flowering of that seed every time we look at the basilica, because the basilica is sitting directly on top of that tomb. If you start from the orb at the very top of that dome and drop a line down, it will drop through 2,000 years of history, through monuments and altars and makeshift walls, all the way down to the hole in the ground where the Romans first made the mistake of discarding that stone, which is Peter.
This very history of the Catholic Church, for which Saints Peter and Paul laid the foundations in the 1st century. In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
Beautiful, and thank you, Alan, for that story. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night, and God bless.